All right, let's talk about money. We all think we know the story, right? First, people bartered, then came coins, then cash. Simple. But what if that whole story is wrong? I mean, completely wrong. The real story of money is so much older and honestly, a lot weirder and more interesting than you'd think.
Yeah, what if the very first money wasn't a coin at all, but something like a necklace? Seriously, picture this. The story of money doesn't start with some king stamping his face on a chunk of gold. It starts tens of thousands of years ago, with our ancestors stringing shells together. And this wasn't just about looking good. No, this was about solving one of the biggest problems we've ever faced as a species: how to cooperate.
So to really understand this, we have to go back. I mean, way back. We're talking about blowing past the Romans, past the ancient Greeks, even before the first cities were built. We're going back 30,000 years, so buckle up, let's get into it.
Okay, so our story really starts with this massive, fundamental human puzzle. How do you get huge groups of people who are basically strangers to trust each other, to work together? The answer, surprisingly, was a brand new technology, and it's not what you think.
So think about it like this. If you're in a small tribe, maybe 30 or 40 people, it's easy, right? I help you, you help me. I remember you owe me one. Scientists call this reciprocal altruism. But what happens when your world gets bigger? When you meet someone from a different tribe, a total stranger? Your brain just can't keep a mental list of favors for hundreds of people. It just doesn't scale. You need something else, a tool to bridge that gap in trust.
And that something else hinges on this one critical idea: unforgeable costliness. This is the absolute key to the whole thing. For an object to have value, to work as money, it has to be genuinely hard to create or find. That difficulty, that sweat, that invested labor is what proves its value. It's a signal, and it's a signal that's really, really hard to fake.
And here's what that actually looked like in the real world. You see things like ostrich eggshell beads, pierced animal teeth, beautiful seashells. These were the world's first collectibles. And they weren't just jewelry. A necklace made of shells that you could only find 500 kilometers from the coast, that wasn't just pretty. That was proof of work. It was a store of value that a stranger, someone from a completely different culture, could look at and instantly understand. And this wasn't just in one place. We see this popping up all over the world, from Africa to Europe to the Americas. It was a universal social technology.
And the effect of this? It was absolutely game-changing. This simple technology of cooperation gave us, Homo sapiens, a massive, massive evolutionary advantage. The archaeology is pretty clear on this. It suggests we were able to live in groups 10 times denser than Neanderthals. Why? Because these collectibles let us build bigger, more complex social networks. Suddenly we could trade, share risks, and specialize in ways that were just impossible before.
Okay, so fast forward a bit, our next big leap takes us to ancient Mesopotamia. And here's where the story takes a really wild turn. Because it turns out money went virtual thousands of years before the first coin was ever minted.
Right, so in Sumer, one of the world's first civilizations, the shekel wasn't a coin you could jingle in your pocket. It wasn't physical at all. It was just an idea, a unit of account, basically a standard measure, that was recorded on clay tablets kept in these huge temple storehouses. It was the original credit system. Most of the economy ran on IOUs, with all the debts being tracked in the central ledger.
And the way they managed this was just genius. Check out this process. First, they'd use these little clay tokens in different shapes to represent different goods, like a cone for grain, a cylinder for an animal. Then they'd seal those tokens inside a hollow clay ball, called a bulla. But here's the clever part. Before sealing it, they'd press the tokens into the wet clay on the outside, so now you have a tamper-proof record of what's inside. It's the world's first receipt. And those little impressions, they eventually evolved into cuneiform, the very first form of writing. And that's the punchline, right there. Writing wasn't invented to write epic poems or prayers to the gods. It was invented for accounting. The need to keep track of all this credit and debt, this totally virtual form of money, is literally what sparked one of the biggest leaps in human history.
So we've gone from trusting the labor it took to make a necklace to trusting an institution, like a temple, to keep the ledger straight. The next big shift introduces a whole new source of trust: the government, the state. And this is where coins finally make their grand entrance.
So picture it. It's around 600 BCE in a place called Lydia, which is in modern-day Turkey. Some king has this brilliant idea. He takes a lump of metal and stamps his official seal on it. And that stamp is a promise.
It's a guarantee of the coin's weight and purity. All of a sudden, you don't have to bring your own scales and test the metal. You don't have to trust the merchant. You just have to trust the king's stamp. It made trade so much easier, so much faster. It absolutely unleashed commerce.
But with this great new power came a great new danger. The Romans took this idea and ran with it, creating this amazing, unified currency, the silver denarius. But whenever the empire got into trouble, when they needed to pay the soldiers, the emperors just couldn't resist the temptation to cheat. They'd start debasing the currency, melting down the silver coins and mixing in cheaper metals like copper. And you can see on this timeline what happened. It started almost pure, but over a couple hundred years, it became basically a copper coin with a thin silver wash. People weren't stupid. They figured it out. Trust evaporated, and massive hyperinflation wrecked the economy. It's a lesson that just keeps repeating itself throughout history.
Okay, so let's jump forward to the modern era, because this is where that tension, the one between money as a reliable store of value and money as a tool for governments, just goes into complete overdrive.
For a good chunk of modern history, we had the gold standard. It acted like an anchor, right? It forced governments to be disciplined with their spending, but it was also super rigid, and that just didn't work during the massive crises of the 20th century. So since 1971, we've all been living in the age of fiat money. That's money that's backed by, well, nothing tangible. It's backed only by the full faith and credit of the government that prints it. Now that gives policymakers incredible flexibility, which is great, but just like in ancient Rome, it always carries that hidden threat, that risk of inflation.
And this is wild, because it brings us full circle right back to ancient Sumer. Think about the money you use every day. More than 90% of it isn't physical cash or coins. It's just digital numbers in bank computers, ones and zeros. We're living in a gigantic global virtual credit system, and it's really built on the exact same idea as those 5,000-year-old clay ledgers.
Which, of course, brings us to today, to our final chapter. And the crazy thing is, this new digital frontier we're exploring is, in a weird way, taking us right back to where we started 30,000 years ago. I mean, just think about what something like Bitcoin is trying to accomplish. It takes the virtual, totally digital nature of our modern money, and it tries to bolt on that ancient principle of unforgeable costliness. It's basically an experiment to see if we can create a digital version of that rare, hard-to-find seashell necklace.
So how do they even do that? Well, the blockchain is basically a global public ledger. It's like that Sumerian bulla, but one that literally everyone on the planet can inspect at the same time. The proof of work, that's the invested labor. It takes a massive amount of real-world computer power and energy to mine a new coin. And finally, the supply isn't controlled by a government or a bank. It's strictly limited by a mathematical algorithm. It's a pretty radical experiment in trying to build trust without needing a central middleman. And this table just lays it all out perfectly. You can see the whole story at a glance. Look at how the trust source changes. It goes from nature and labor to the temple, to the state, and now, maybe to cryptography. The form of money changes too, from a physical thing to a virtual record. But the fundamental challenges, scarcity and trust, they never go away. They're always the core of the problem.
And that's really the most important thing to remember from all of this. The technology is always changing. We've gone from shells to clay ledgers to computer code. But the function of money, its real purpose, has stayed exactly the same. It's always been our species' best tool for cooperating with each other on a massive scale.
When you get right down to it, money isn't really a thing at all. It's a shared story. It's a 30,000-year-old story that we all agree to believe in. A story about trust and trade and how we work together to build the future.
So, this incredible journey from shells to coat shows us that money is never finished. It's always evolving. It's a technology for trust that we're still working on, still trying to perfect. And that leaves us with a pretty big question, doesn't it? What's our chapter in this story going to look like?